Welcome back to Neon Liberalism. I'm Samantha Hancocksley. And this week I want to bring things a little bit back down to earth, out of the clouds of intellectual controversy and into like real material questions about the economy. And this sense that I think a lot of Americans have that there's a kind of malaise in our country, that the economy isn't really working for people the way that they want it to, that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with how things are, and maybe what we can do to try and get our economy back on track. So to try and talk about some of these questions, I'm really excited to have on Becky Chao, who is the Director of Policy and Research from the Economic Security Project, um, who's just come out with the affordability framework, which is a big white paper trying to understand a lot of these questions. So yeah, Becky, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so I guess my first question for you is just like what do you think is going wrong with the American economy?
Hmm, great question. So, the Economic Security Project has long advocated for policies that build economic power for all Americans. And we know that Americans are hurting. We're in an affordability crisis. People are worrying about how to afford the basics. They can't afford rent. They can't afford to put groceries on the table to feed their families. And we wanted to know why this is, and our answer was the affordability framework. We introduced this framework to help policymakers better understand how we got here and looked across sectors to identify commonalities across the economy and found that broken markets and broken incomes are driving the affordability crisis. It's not just one thing, we need to fix both.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I want to come back to this broken markets, broken incomes diagnosis in a minute. But I also kind of want to ask you about the the malaise, this problem that we're all having.
Yes.
Um, and I guess one question I have is this a new problem or is this an old problem? Right? Because there's some people would say, well, look, it's in our lifetimes there have been times when the economy's been very good and people liked it, and it's really especially in the last 4 8 years, maybe whatever you could clock it in different places, where people have become really unsatisfied. Um, or you might say, actually, it's extends back much further in time. These problems are much older, and like something's been wrong for a long time here. So I'm wondering where you come down on that.
Yeah, I think we definitely understands that these problems have been building for a really long time. Even before the pandemic, I think now things are really coming to a head where the economic angst is just really hard to escape. It feels like it's the number one issue. And it's also a big part of why President Trump won re-election and returned to office, because he essentially ran on affordability, promising to lower prices. And we can dive into this a little bit later. That hasn't been the case exactly, and contributing to this acute sense of economic pain that Americans are feeling across partisan lines. Um, but we really take the stance that these problems date back decades because of policy failures and the failures of public institutions to deliver for everyday Americans. And essentially, the decisions that policymakers have made over the last couple decades of neoliberal policymaking have eroded pathways for everyday people and kept them trapped in this cycle of economic precarity.
Okay. So yeah, what are some of these policies and decisions that you think have led us here?
We take the stance that it's both broken markets and broken incomes that have led to this affordability crisis. Um, Under broken markets, we've seen how policies have led to the rise of gatekeepers, both corporate power. things like how corporate consolidation overcharged families $5,000 a year. But at the same time, weak governance structures are also constraining supply and making things more expensive for everyday families. We also have things like fragmented markets, which is especially pertinent for people living in rural communities. The free market philosophy just doesn't lend itself to good incentives for private firms to be good providers for folks. And we see this in rural hospitals, especially where these hospitals have to keep staff in operating rooms 24 hours, even if there may not be enough patients coming in for service. That adds to operating costs. And that's why a lot of federal programs that provide essential funding through Medicaid is so critical to ensuring that people in rural communities have access to these essential services. And we also have corporations who have taken advantage of predatory pricing practices to drive up costs and force people to pay more money just because they can. And we've seen this across the board in housing, where corporate landlords use RealPage's pricing algorithm to charge tenants $70 more a month. And it's happening in AI as well, where we're seeing data centers passing on the costs of their additional energy consumption onto future households. But even when markets work, we are also looking at the other side of the equation, where essentials remain out of reach for most Americans because of broken incomes. And these are things like life cycle mismatches, where big costs arrive when earnings are low, when people are starting off their early careers, or when they're not capable of working, for example, when they're sick or when they're retired, and they're starting, and usually people are starting families in their late 20s or early 30s, but wages are not peaking at that time. But we all know how expensive childcare can cost, up to tens of thousands of dollars a year, depending on where you live. But it's also things like rising inequality, where insufficient income and the high cost of being poor just makes affordability so much harder. But it also includes things like big economic trends, like recessions that have long lasting consequences on people's lives. Where if you're graduating into a recession, your earnings are depressed for 10 to 15 years, not just for the duration of the recession itself.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot in there,
Yeah.
and I hope we're going to get to talk about some of it. And I think it's kind of interesting to compare this with other narratives about what's gone wrong in our country, right? Like one pretty common narrative, like is the populist narrative that says, look, or like the left populist narrative. There's also right populist narratives, but for the left populist narrative that says it's all corporations, it's billionaires, it's the 1%. They're hoarding everything, and what we need to do is redistribute. Right, we need to take some stuff that they have and spread it out over the rest of us, the 99%, and that'll just kind of solve our problems. And I think that's a very common narrative you'll see on social media and just kind of in the general popular consciousness. Um, and recently, that's been challenged pretty directly. Book you may have heard of, Abundance, by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. And they say pretty explicitly, right, that they want to challenge that narrative. They want to challenge the redistributionist narrative on the left and also on the right. They want to say, no, no, no. Our problem is that we don't have enough stuff to start with, And if we want to have enough for everybody, we need to build more of it. And that's going to encompass a lot of different sectors. But like that is also like they're quite close. This is a master narrative, as they call it. Like it's a simple story that you can tell people and that you can apply to a lot of different policy domains. And I'm wondering like where you come down on like this contrast between the redistributionist and the productionist narratives here.
Great question. I think what we come down to uh, is what we do with the affordability framework is we identified a complex set of actors, institutions, and processes that are making life harder for people while recognizing that these outcomes are systemic. And I think it's so important too to recognize the role that corporate power has on our economy, especially in this new era where we're seeing an alliance between corporate and state power. So we really do need populism to help challenge that. But at the same time, I think one thing that we've noticed is a lot of approaches look at just one side of the equation. Abundance, for example, looks at just government bottlenecks to broken markets like housing. And that's so important, but it's just one piece of the broader and complex affordability crisis. And it also makes it harder to translate some of their lessons to other sectors of the economy. So to fully address the affordability crisis, policymakers have to consider both broken incomes and broken markets. And that's the crux of our framework and how it's different from abundance and some of the other thinking out there. We really try to take a comprehensive approach to look across sectors to identify broken markets and broken incomes as dual drivers of the affordability crisis. In short, markets aren't working well enough to um, give people what they need because prices are too high or there's not enough supply. And even when markets do work, inequality and insufficient incomes keep the basics out of reach for too many Americans.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to me because I like there are a lot of these old dichotomies, right? Things that I kind of grew up with, under like thinking about how politics works, and well, there's pro-regulation and there's anti-regulation, or you can be pro-government or anti-government, or these days, right? You can think all our problems are about corporate power, or you can think our problems are about government over regulation. And I think Ned Resnikoff has a very good article about this called like the YIMBY theory of power, where he kind of talks about like a lot of the stuff seems to go hand in hand, right? Like in housing in particular, which is his area of interest, talks about how like yeah, there's a wide array of government regulations that has caused, artificial scarcity in housing that makes it hard to build. But this also has synergized with corporate power, with the power of big developers who like know how to like navigate these complicated regulatory structures, and that has led them to have outsized market power in certain industries or certain areas. Um, and so really like it doesn't need to be a fight. You can recognize that there are problems with certain kinds of government regulations, and there are also problems with corporate consolidation and corporate power.
I think that's absolutely right. Too often, a lot of approaches just jump immediately to these siloed approaches. And I get that there's this instinct to think that there's going to be a magic solution to all of these problems. But sadly, the affordability crisis is just so entrenched across our economy, and we do need um, more than we do need to tackle both broken markets and broken incomes at the end of the day. And I think what our framework is trying to do is to give everybody a shared vocabulary so that we can focus on what actually drives people's costs. And we emphasize that each part is necessary for the whole. I think in asking what structures make the essentials, including like housing, as you named, it's often the biggest part of people's household budgets. What's making these things so unaffordable and out of reach? We can get a better sense of what's gone wrong before we dive into solutions to get us out of this affordability crisis.
Yeah. So one question I kind of want to ask you is one of the advantages of populist narratives is that they place the bad guys kind of far away, and there aren't very many of them, and it's not anybody you know. But you kind of highlight how at least some of these problems, so some of these broken markets are much closer to home. Like you talk a little bit about occupational licensing, um, which if you're not obsessed with these topics, it's like, oh yeah, you need a license from the state in order to cut hair in many states. This turns out to be true, right? And hair cutting, it's not medicine. Nobody's life is on the line when they go into a barber shop. If someone does your makeup a little bit wrong, it's really not the end of the world. um, so it's unclear why there's a compelling public interest in this, and it does drive up the prices of these services and it's again a kind of artificial scarcity. But at the same time, the hairdressers in your state are not billionaires, right? They're not some giant corporation that is like pumping money out of your community. They're working people that but they, earn a certain rent from this kind of artificial scarcity. So I'm wondering a little bit about like how that works out. Like how do the politics of that work out? Right? How does confronting broken markets work when some of these broken markets seem to like work for some people, right? They like them broken.
Right. That's a big part of why we call them gatekeepers in our framework. Um, I'll say, I think on top of or a big part of the economic angst that Americans are feeling today is this um, dissatisfaction with longstanding inequality in our country. We know that it's not just that pessimism about the economy is at an all-time high. It's also feelings that the American dream is dead. Some might argue that it was never alive in the first place. But I think about how core to the American dream this idea that each generation could achieve more and obtain class mobility and go further than your parents. But for a lot of young people, that's no longer the case. And on top of that, we also have the fact that public trust in government is it's broken as well. It's near historic lows. And I think what we're seeing with the Trump administration is he's making a lot of economic policies that worsen the affordability crisis and deepen this gap between working people and the wealthiest few. We've seen that Americans already couldn't keep up with the rising costs of housing, healthcare, food, and utilities. But all these things are only going to get more expensive because of changes in the big beautiful bill. Just looking at healthcare insurance alone, cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, and the ACA mean that insurance premiums will get even more expensive. And in some states, it might even go up by 500%. And it feels like we have a real opportunity to overcome some of this strong distrust in public institutions, where voters across party lines want the government to do more to address their economic needs. And we've seen how um, there's there's also a sense of optimism, I think, when we're talking right now after the most recent round of elections, where um, so much uh, so many campaigns in New York, in Virginia, in New Jersey ran on affordability, and we saw that that really resonated with the electorate because a lot of these candidates ended up winning, um, and you've seen how these narratives are really speaking to everyday people, that we don't want to live in a society where only the 1% can get ahead and um, have access to a life where you can afford the essentials, and we have a real chance through affordability to make sure that people can see and experience for themselves the impacts of policies, so that we can start rebuilding trust in our institutions to serve and deliver real results for everyday people.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that like inequality is a problem in our country, right? We've seen inequality growing steadily, inequality of wealth, inequality of income, right? That the benefits in a lot of ways do seem to be going to the top 1% or the top 0.01%. And that, as we can see, like you talked a little bit about they're using that wealth and that power to like try and entrench themselves in government and in media to buy up, whether it's Twitter or the Washington Post or whatever it is, and like try to put their message out there, or like the extent to which Musk appears to have like bought himself a position in the Trump cabinet. Like that was a whole thing that happened. But I do kind of want to bring this back to this question of like, well, like something that often gets brought up to YIMBYs, right? Is one person's unaffordable housing is another person's home equity, right? That 65% of American households own their own homes, right? That's not 1% of Americans owning property. That's 65% of households. And for many people, that American dream is, the white picket fence is, for a lot of people, it seems to be tied to property values, that this is how you build generational wealth and how you save for retirement is by having home equity. And arguably, that's tied to this artificial scarcity of housing, to precisely these broken markets that we're talking about. So I'm curious how you plan to like square that when you try to sell this to people.
Yeah. I think you're right that policymaking always involves trade-offs. But where we stand is that can't always be at the expense of marginalized communities. It's often poor and middle class families who end up on the short end of the trade-off, and we can't continue that pattern. You're right in naming that building more housing to lower rent is better for renters than for landlords, for instance. And that's a worthwhile trade-off, we think. Um, I think we're also thinking about both how we balance near-term and long-term solutions. For housing, our affordability framework makes us realize that um, it's both broken markets and broken incomes, and we've all seen these stats about how 50% of renters are spending more than a third of their income on housing. And at the same time, you're right that home ownership is this vehicle for wealth building, and it's an essential part of the American dream. But we're seeing that dream become much less attainable. People are older when they are finally able to afford to buy their own home. Um, and the affordability framework helps us realize that the solution is not just building more homes or addressing corporate power. Tackling one of these things alone is incomplete, and we need to fix both, and that market solutions need to be paired with things like social insurance, tenant protections, and rent control, because adding more housing supply doesn't help families who are desperately searching for affordable housing today, since new housing supply would take years to become available on the market. And we also need policy ideas that address people's immediate needs to solve for the acute affordable housing crisis in the near term. And that's why things like rent control, tenant protections, and rent stabilization are all just as important.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, I guess I do want to take a maybe a little bit of a step back from the specifics of the housing question. And there's a sentence in your framework that I thought was really striking. That you said, our goal is to move our economy from defaulting to no unless to yes if. Um, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on what that means, what that's about.
Mm. Um, so I think there's been a tendency in our democratic processes. It kind of goes back to um, one of the major lessons raised by folks from the abundance camp about government's ability to get in its own way, and we've seen how democratic processes that are meant to bring in um, the public into this shared governance model can get co-opted and can get gamed by special interest groups, and prevent good policy outcomes. So, for example, we've seen how uh, lobbying from private industry was able to stop rulemaking at the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to bring more affordable hearing aids. And the same thing happened at the Federal Trade Commission when it tried to pass a click to cancel subscriptions rule. Um, and that is an example of how these democratic processes that are meant to bring communities and uh, impacted communities into the policymaking process get uh, manipulated into these bottlenecks because gatekeepers want the bottlenecks to be there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. There's this whole problem, right? Back in the '60s, back in the '70s, people were like afraid of government. People were afraid of big government. It maybe done some bad stuff back in the '60s and '70s, and so there's this whole movement to like put more accountability on government, right? You're going to have more ways to sue the government. You're going to have more like these rulemaking processes that you're talking about with public comment periods. You're going to have more environmental impact assessments. In my city, in Pittsburgh, there's like this is a tiny little bugbear, but it's my bugbear, and this is my podcast, so I get to talk about it. Right, there's this sense that the city government wasn't responsive enough to communities, so we created the Registered Community Organization, which is an NGO that is like kind of tied to the city in a certain way that is supposed to represent the community to city council. And you look at that and it's like, but isn't that just what your city council person is supposed to do, right? They got elected by the community to represent the community in government. And now we've added yet another layer of representing the community to government. And we've done this everywhere, right? We've done this again from the most local level in my city to like these, like you're talking about, federal rulemaking processes that affect how medical devices are sold all across the country. Um, and so, anyways, I have what I'm trying to say is I have a lot of sympathy for this line, right? That we've created a system where you can't just do stuff if it's legal, right? You have to like go through all this process to like get discretionary approval, versus like yes, you can like here's the rules. If you comply, go ahead and do it, which I think is a much more productive model if you think again that we actually do need to produce more stuff in this country. So yeah, anyways, I have a lot of sympathy for that. Is what I'm trying to say here. I guess though, I want to ask you a little bit about corporate power and the role of corporate power in this system, because that's something that, again, abundance doesn't talk very much about this. Like, I think YIMBYs have a theory of it, but it's not really what YIMBYs spend a lot of time talking about. Um, and so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about corporate power and like monopoly theory, and where do the neo-Brandeisians come into this whole debate?
Yeah, I think even before the Biden administration, the fault lines in our economy were very clear and hard to dispute. Inequality was high, and I think that was a major driver of the resurgence and interest in reviving antitrust as one tool to tackle this growing inequality, which is in part driven by concentrated private power. And we saw that under the Biden administration, there was a renewed commitment to leaning into the full potential of antitrust enforcement, to tackle corporate power and to make sure that we were keeping prices, or tackling market structures that led to higher prices, limited supply, and essentially less economic freedom that people were experiencing. I think a big part of what we saw, and credit to the neo-Brandisian movement and others in the anti-monopoly space, was how, for the first time in over a century, we had antitrust enforcement embrace an approach that prioritized labor and workers explicitly as a key constituency in their assessment of merger review. We also saw this in the Federal Trade Commission's non-compete rule, to free workers from coercive contracts that employers use to trap them in low-paying jobs, and make it harder for them to quit and take a job in a similar industry, even when it was things like pet grooming, and sandwich artists at Jimmy John's, not just like high-level executives that you typically think are impacted by these non-compete rules.
Yeah, the Jimmy John's things always got me, right? That if you wanted to make sandwiches at Jimmy John's, they would make you sign a contract that said you weren't going to go work for Subway,
Right.
right? Like, just seems kind of egregious. And there are other examples, right, that you give in the paper. Like, you talk a lot about surprise fees or hidden fees. Could you talk a little bit about like the way that corporations are kind of exploiting their market power to like obscure prices from people?
Yeah. Um, I will say that a lot of this has gotten really worse for the affordability crisis in the age of AI, where we're seeing um, companies being able to hide the ball on how much things cost and deceive and prey on consumers who don't have the time, um, to do the proper research to investigate how much things cost and do a true shopping comparison. You see this in hotels where there are resort fees and all these other hidden fees tacked on that aren't disclosed upfront, and the consumer has to navigate and click through a bunch of screens before they can see what the true cost is. It's also things like how certain costs may be passed on to consumers, like how AI is becoming this big new thing, and to power AI data centers, they need tremendous amounts of energy. And there's initial research pointing to the fact that those additional costs are very likely to be passed on to consumers themselves instead of asking the tech companies who are using this energy to pay for it themselves. And when there's less transparency, there's just more space for these companies to take advantage of these information asymmetries and charge everyday families more for products that they're keeping the same. They're not, innovating. They're not improving to make sure that the quality is better.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think this comes back to this question of power and market power in a lot of ways, right? That for a long time, in this country, we had the Chicago school of monopoly law theory, right, which says, well, look, the only question about a monopoly is how it impacts the consumer, right? And if the monopoly can say, look, we're going to acquire this other company and we'll be bigger and we'll use that scale to deliver cheaper prices, that's great. And for a long time, that was kind of the operative theory, right? And then we have the neo-Brandeisians who come along and say, yeah, but you have to talk about power. Right? You have to talk about how monopolies give corporations power and how they will use that power. I mean, because this is just, power corrupts, right? You give
Right.
people power, there's always that temptation to use it or to abuse it, right? And that companies who have a lot of market power or pricing power or like you were saying, informational asymmetries, that they will exploit to try and like find ways to extract more value from consumers. So, anyways, I think this is all to the good. I think it's good to like. I know this makes me old fashioned, but I think competition is good. Right?
Yeah,
I think it's
I don't
a
think
discipline.
yes, I don't think it's old-fashioned at all. I think what we've seen under the Biden administration is this interest in examining what fair competition looks like and how we can move away from this purely extractive economy where we see how, with limited income, folks don't have that much to work with. And with corporate power, companies just have the ability to steal and extract more money from hardworking families.
Yeah, so I talked a lot about broken markets so far. I do want to talk about broken incomes, the other half of your framework, and I was really struck by some of the figures that you give there, right? That since 1979, worker productivity and wages appear to have basically decoupled, right? That wages have increased since 1979, right? Real wages have increased, but worker productivity has increased so much more, and compensation hasn't really tracked that. And I'm wondering, like, could you say a little bit about that, how that happened? Right, like 1979 is a really specific year to use. So I'm curious, like, what happened in 1979 that led to this decoupling?
Yeah, there are so many reasons for this trend. There's things like the federal minimum wage not keeping up, but also a decline in unionization, where we've also seen, as a result, declining worker bargaining power. And we've also seen changes in the tax code that favor corporations and the wealthy over working people. And of course, you also have deregulation. You have approaches that failed to check private power, I mean, through lax antitrust enforcement as a result of the Chicago school, and that made it all the more possible um, for capital, for corporations to hold onto a greater share of the productivity gains.
Yeah, I think all that's important, like the decline, like you say, basically the decline of labor power. Um, but it's interesting. to talk a little bit about the macroeconomics of it, which comes up a little bit in your framework, where yeah, wages have increased, but most of the wage increases have come during sustained a few like identifiable sustained periods of low unemployment. Right. So one theory of like what happens here is we're talking about the Volcker shock, right? We're talking about the Federal Reserve taking a hammer to the American economy, to inflation specifically, and ever since then, really prioritizing price stability as part of its dual mandate, right? That the most important thing for the Fed is to get inflation under control and to keep it low. And that means tolerating a lot of slack in the labor market. And it's only in these periods when we run a slightly hotter economy that wages actually start to catch up. Do you think that's like a reasonable theory of what's been happening here?
Um, I'm not sure. I think we are seeing how like high inflation um, and economic downturns can have really long-standing consequences on workers, where it's not just the the immediate period that they're impacted, but just thinking about how even workers that are displaced in economic downturns, even after they find new jobs, wages are often lower for decades, which has really big implications for how much they can afford housing, healthcare, and other essentials.
Yeah, I thought that part of your paper was really interesting, right? That it emphasizes like recessions are really bad. Like it turns out, surprise, recessions are really bad. They're really bad for workers, right? That like you say, it's not just that you're going to take a temporary hit to your wages or a temporary inability to find a job. It appears to like permanently change your trajectory in a way that is bad for you. Right? So avoiding recessions is very important, but you also talk about inflation and how inflation is also quite destructive. I was wondering if you could say more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, so we saw how recessions impact wages, especially for households with little savings. It it's already so expensive to be poor in this country. But with high inflation, the cost of everyday essentials, rent, groceries, and utilities get even higher, and it just doesn't keep up with the paychecks that people are receiving. And what happens there is these families are forced to make tough decisions. We were actually we had launched an affordability tour where we hosted listening sessions in both California and Illinois and heard directly from communities on the ground about how they were experiencing our economy. And oftentimes, folks are making these hard choices between keeping the heat on or paying to put groceries on the table. They're making decisions to cut back on some of these essentials, or they're making decisions to take on debt. Like we're seeing more people use credit cards, payday loans, even, and buy now, pay later program so that they can pay for things like, well, you'd be surprised. I was surprised when I learned this. Even Chipotle takes buy now, pay later programs. So that's the type of economy that we live in right now,
Yeah, so buy now, pay later burrito. That's really quite something.
right?
Um, I guess so. I guess my question then is like, what's your evaluation of the Biden economy? Right?
Mm,
Because under Biden, right, they ran pretty expansive fiscal policy, pretty loose monetary policy. We had high inflation, but we also had very low unemployment. And we had wage growth that does appear to have outpaced inflation. If I have my stats right, right? Inflation was a problem, but wage growth outpaced inflation. Like, what do you think of that package? Was like that the right package, or is there things that we could be doing better next time around?
Yeah, I think it's hard because inequality is just such a entrenched problem. It dates back decades. And the Biden administration, I think we saw a lot of headlines that I think still hold true to some extent about how it marked this departure from a neoliberal consensus, and it rejected this core belief that markets will fix themselves, that by pulling yourselves up from the bootstrap, you can improve your circumstances. And we saw the Biden administration embrace these broad, sweeping, progressive economic policies through industrial policy and the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it was smart to invest in these in capacity to build semiconductor chips in the the context of the Biden administration. Uh, these things are critical for not just AI development, which became a big thing in the last couple of years, and computers, but also things that everyday Americans use, like cars. And they also invested in building out green infrastructure. But the reality is, a lot of these big, broad sweeping economic policies take a long term perspective where you're not feeling the impact for years to come. And I think that was a big part of why there was such a big disconnect, a big gap between these policies and the experience that people had in their day-to-day lives, where they didn't really see the impact of these progressive economic policies on their personal lives. And it didn't matter how many progressive economic policies the Biden administration secured. This ultimately didn't translate into political resonance. And I think a lot of that contributed to worsening the affordability crisis and this situation where Americans across the country, across party lines, are just frustrated, and there's a big appetite for change. And there's growing consensus that our current economic system failed families, that the system is rigged, and only the top 1% and corporations are benefiting instead of the many.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. That, I mean, I hope at this point everybody would agree that Bidenomics did not have political resonance. That people didn't like it very much. It seems one of the things that I worry about, right, is we're coming up on a big retirement crunch. Right, the baby boomers are all in the process of retiring. That's gonna, you're gonna have a lot more retired people per working age family in America. That's basically baked into the chips at this point. Um, right, that's going to increase costs for Social Security. It's going to increase costs for healthcare. Old people take a lot of healthcare. Right, so that's a really big fiscal outlay that's coming down the pipeline right now. And you're also suggesting we should also have a lot more income supports for young families. We should have more, public services in rural areas. That's going to be another kind of fiscal outlay. So we should have a lot of fiscal outlay. And on the one hand, maybe that's good. Maybe this is all going to drive a tight labor market and it's going to drive higher wages. Um, or is it going to produce more inflation, which seems to be pretty politically unpopular? And so I'm just kind of curious, like, how you propose to kind of thread that macroeconomic needle here.
Yeah, I think, we live in a country that is rich enough to think about what what are the values that make up the economy that we live in? How do we build an economy that actually delivers for all Americans and provides strong care infrastructure for us as we move through life, as we move from starting families to retiring, where we need long-term care and healthcare services that are just so much more expensive. And I think there are worthwhile trade-offs that we can make to figure out how we can um, make sure that people feel like they have the support that they need so that they can not just survive in today's economy, but actually thrive.
Okay. Um, I don't really find that a particularly satisfying answer, um, but I've asked a lot of questions about macroeconomics. So maybe I should ask something else. Um, and mostly, I've had my like liberal technocrat hat on while I've been asking you these questions. But liberals aren't the only people in the room. Turns out, right? We also have a Republican Party in America, and like you said, Donald Trump ran on affordability, and he's made um, an economic policy kind of central to his pitch to the American people, and that's tariffs, right? That we are being robbed by foreign countries, that we want to reindustrialize America and bring manufacturing back and bring back good jobs, and the way we're going to do that is through tariffs. And so I'm kind of curious, what's the affordability framework have to say about free trade versus tariffs versus the terms of international trade, and like how does that affect what's affordable in America?
Yeah, great question. I think we're seeing that a lot of the economic angst that people are experiencing, they do point to tariffs as driving a lot of that because they're seeing um, the its impact on how much more expensive things are costing when they try to buy groceries. Even the tariffs are having a wide ranging impact, and I think while they can sometimes be strategically used to boost some industries, they also um, are used uh, during this Trump administration context to drive unaffordability. Ultimately, we're seeing early estimates that show that tariffs are costing families $2,400 each year, and that makes a really big difference when people are already having a tough time affording the basics.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a straightforward way in which you put a tax on imports, and that's going to make the import more expensive, right? And like that translates very very directly into consumer prices. Whatever this seems to be borne out by all the economic research, right? That like the point of a tariff or any kind of tax on trade um, is gonna fall or whatever. The incidence of tariffs is an ongoing research program, blah blah blah. But like a lot of it does seem to fall on consumers. Um, but I'm also curious. You said something about strategic industries, right? That there might be strategic reasons to protect certain industries. So maybe in some cases, tariffs are a good thing and they are going to boost like domestic manufacturing or protect domestic manufacturing. What did you have in mind?
Um, I'm I have to admit that we're not quite there yet. But we have learned from some of our partners in this space that they can sometimes be an effective tool when used strategically and thoughtfully. But what we're seeing now is that tariffs are being used as a blunt instrument. And that's why we're seeing um, this impact on across the economy, where it's small business owners trying to navigate the increased costs that tariffs are adding to their business. And sometimes you may have seen that even places like coffee shops are adding a tariff surcharge on the receipts and passing on these costs to consumers. And
Mhm.
politically, that's a really big problem for Trump.
Yeah, it turns out we don't grow coffee in America. Who knew? I mean, aside from everybody. So yeah, I agree. Tariffs are a complicated question. It does feel like the consensus on free trade is cracked open in a certain way, and there's a lot more conversation about what the terms of trade should be. But that's not your bailiwick, so maybe I won't ask too much about it. I am curious about the other, like the much more like the other very well known aspect of Trump's agenda, which is deportations, anti-immigration, discouraging immigration. And you listen to JD Vance, and he'll sell this in economic terms. He basically says, they're coming here and they're American corporations are exploiting these immigrants with low wages. And if we just get rid of the immigrants, that'll increase wages for Americans and it'll make housing cheaper and it'll make everything cheaper because there will be fewer people, stealing your jobs and your housing. And I'm wondering how your framework or how you would respond to those ideas.
Oh goodness. I think what we're seeing is there's really not that much evidence that immigrants are driving the unaffordability crisis. Immigrants also create jobs by adding to our economy, and the wage effects are neutral. And they can also help make things to address the affordability crisis.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. I mean, I think that is the correct the correct answer, right? That all the research just shows, like, no, they're not stealing our jobs. Come on, like they come to America and they just act like all the rest of Americans, right? They produce things and they also consume things and create jobs because you have a job, making stuff for them and they make stuff for you, and like this is the positive sum exchange that makes the world go round. Um, Right. So I think that there are definitely ways to try and respond to these right wing provocations. Like you say, from an affordability perspective, from saying like, yeah, actually, like, whether it's nurses or construction workers or tech workers or any kind of worker in any industry, right? People come to America and generally seem to make the place better. Um,
Mhm. And I think this is where we're also seeing some uh, departures, if you will, from like the rise of right wing populism, where a lot of their agendas is based on an exclusionary framework. But our vision through an affordability crisis is thinking about how we can build an economy that works for everyone, no matter who you are, your country of origin. If you've decided to make America your home, you should also be empowered to a good life where you have the economic power to thrive.
yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Um, So yeah, I mean, this has been a very interesting conversation. I mean, you see, like, there's so much like infighting on the left, on the broadly speaking, the left these days, and I think some of it just comes from people who prioritize like feel like winning an argument over like actually being right, and like they need to stake out that like their particular theory is the only possible theory, right? And I don't know, I just find like some of these like abundance versus anti-abundance, like the Brandeisians versus the YIMBYs, like I find these debates so tiresome because I just don't see the conflict that I'm supposed to see here. Right. I think we can think, yeah, there are problems with wages and compensation in this country. There are problems with the provision of public service. There are problems with corporate power. And there's also problems with dysfunctional government, right? With government that is over regulating a housing market, for example, or creating, you know, economic protection laws that don't actually, excuse me, environmental protection laws that don't actually protect the environment in any measurable way and are being used to block, environmentally good things, whether that's congestion pricing or green energy or transmission lines or whatever it is. Um, so this has been a really interesting conversation to try and bring some of these perspectives together. Any closing words for the audience here?
No, this was a great conversation, Samantha. Thanks for asking some really thoughtful questions. I guess I will say that what what I'm personally excited by is we're in this moment when people are asking a really good question about how do we deliver on the promise of an economy that works for all Americans. And abundance has their own answer. And it's created, it's injected a lot of new interests in the economic debate, and that is ultimately a good thing. But as you said, it's only one piece of the puzzle, and it doesn't, as much as we would like there to be like a silver bullet that would fix our economy. Um, I think we're finding that the reality is the affordability crisis is much more complex and driven by a whole slew of things, mainly broken incomes and broken markets.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there's always this lure of master narratives and simple theories. And, I think Trump came in with a master narrative and a simple theory, and I don't think it's worked very well for anybody. Um, right. And I think so much of this depends on the details, like you say, on the complexity, that it matters not just having a nice story to tell, but really being competent to understand the details of the economy and what's actually going wrong if you want to fix it. Um, and I also agree with you that like we're living in a time where it feels like the consensus that used to govern our country has just imploded, right? That's not there anymore. And hopefully, we are going to continue racking up electoral victories, and there will be a chance to really try something new and something that might work better. So I think the future in that respect is bright.
Right. And there's a lot of hope at this moment, I think, where we have a real test in governing in this moment. Like we have opportunities where we saw a lot of candidates run on affordability and they won, and now we have the chance to move from rhetoric to actual impact to change reality for millions of Americans and figure out how we can show people that democracy works, that government can help families and markets can be fair.
All right. Well, that's a good note to end on. Yeah, Becky, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.